The war was finally over. After 6 long years that had burned Europe to the ground, silence began to return. But for millions of men wearing the gray uniform of the Wehrmacht, the word peace didn't mean freedom. It meant captivity. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, nearly 11 million German soldiers laid down their weapons across Europe. The largest portion of them, over 5 million, fell into American hands. They were called POWs, prisoners of war. For many of these men, it was the first time in years they could stop running, stop killing, and simply breathe. In the first weeks after Germany's surrender, the American army faced a new problem: what to do with millions of enemies. Camps appeared overnight, fenced fields, old airbases, even open meadows surrounded by barbed wire. Trucks and trains brought endless lines of exhausted men, covered in mud, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They were no longer soldiers. They were defeated, broken humans. In these first chaotic days, the Americans treated the prisoners with a mix of fear and caution. They were fed, checked for weapons, and assigned numbers. Many expected harsh punishment. They had heard rumors about Soviet camps in the East, where prisoners disappeared forever. But to their surprise, the Americans were human. The food was simple but edible. Medical officers treated the sick. Even guards spoke without hatred. It was the beginning of something none of them expected: respect. In one of the largest holding areas near Remagen in western Germany, a camp known as the Rheinwiesenlager stretched across the Rhine Valley. It was little more than an open field, surrounded by wire. Thousands slept under the sky, their blankets made of grass, their beds the cold ground. Rain turned the place into mud, and men huddled together for warmth. Yet even there, something changed. They were alive, and they were not being executed. As weeks turned into months, thousands of POWs were transported overseas, to America. Ships that once carried tanks and ammunition now carried prisoners. The journey across the Atlantic was long and silent. Some feared they were being taken for forced labor. Others simply hoped for food and rest. But when the first groups arrived in ports like New York, Boston, and New Orleans, their fear began to fade. The camps in America were nothing like the rumors. They found themselves in the open countryside: Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia, Illinois. Rows of wooden barracks stood behind fences, but inside were clean bunks, showers, and kitchens. Meals were regular. The Geneva Convention rules were followed. The prisoners were even paid small wages for working on nearby farms or in factories. First, it felt like a dream. The same soldiers who had fought against the United States now picked cotton, harvested corn, and built barns under the same sun as the Americans. Farmers shook their hands, gave them coffee, sometimes even invited them to Sunday lunch. For men who had lived through bombings, hunger, and fear, it felt like stepping into another world. One former German soldier, Heinrich Müller, later recalled, "We expected to be hated. We expected revenge. But instead, we were treated as men." The first time an American farmer called me son, I didn't know how to answer. I almost cried. Stories like Heinrich's spread through the camps. The prisoners realized that the war was truly over, at least here. They started forming choirs, building libraries, even publishing small camp newspapers. American officers encouraged them to learn English, to read about democracy, to rethink the ideas they had been taught under Hitler's regime. Meanwhile, letters from home told a darker story. Germany was in ruins. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin were piles of ashes. Families were starving. Many of the POWs realized that the life awaiting them back home might be worse than the camp they lived in now. They began to fear release. By 1946, some camps had become small communities, disciplined, organized, almost peaceful. The prisoners worked during the day and played football in the evening. The guards often joined in. Some friendships began that would last decades. When the time came to send them home, thousands of these men hesitated. Many begged to stay. It sounded absurd, enemy soldiers pleading not to be freed. But for them, America had become a place of stability, food, and dignity. Back home, they knew there would be nothing but ruins and guilt. One American officer later said, "They came as enemies. They left as men who had seen the best and worst of both sides." Some cried when the trucks came to take them away. The war was over. But for many of these men, the peace they found in captivity felt more human than anything they had known before. And as the ships carried them back across the Atlantic, toward a shattered homeland, many whispered the same words in broken English. "God bless America." When the war ended in May 1945, millions of German soldiers found themselves standing in silence. Their weapons gone, their flags lowered, their empire collapsed. For years, they had been told they were the chosen army of Europe, invincible under Hitler's rule. But in the final days, what they saw was chaos. Cities burning, civilians fleeing, and officers deserting. The surrender did not come as one moment of peace, but as a slow collapse. On roads across Germany, entire divisions laid down their arms. They walked toward the advancing Allied lines, hands raised, their faces gray with exhaustion. Many preferred to surrender to the Americans or British, fearing the Soviets most of all. In the East, they had seen what Soviet revenge looked like. In the West, they hoped for a chance at survival. The transformation from enemy to prisoner began the moment they crossed into American control. Soldiers who had once shouted orders now stood quietly in lines. Their helmets were gone, belts taken away, pockets searched. Each man was tagged with a small card name, rank, and unit. It was the first sign that they were no longer soldiers of a nation, but numbers in a system. For many, it was a strange kind of relief. The fear of death had ended, replaced by uncertainty. Some felt shame, others numbness. There were no speeches, no flags, no farewell. Just the long march into captivity. The Americans were organized but overwhelmed. They had expected thousands of prisoners, not millions. Camps had to be built almost overnight. In Germany, France, and Belgium, large open areas were fenced with barbed wire, turning farmlands into temporary holding pens. Conditions varied. Some camps were clean and well managed. Others were muddy fields where men slept under the open sky. One U.S. soldier later wrote in his diary, "We were feeding prisoners faster than we could count them. They came in waves, hundreds at a time. Tired, dirty, and hungry, but glad to be alive." Inside the camps, time seemed to stop. The men who had once fought for Hitler now sat together in silence, waiting for food, waiting for orders, waiting for news. Some tried to hold on to their military discipline, standing in rows, cleaning their boots, saluting officers. Others gave up entirely. They were simply glad to survive one more day. Food was basic: canned meat, bread, coffee substitute, but compared to the hunger back in Germany, it was enough. Medical teams treated the wounded and the sick. Chaplains walked through the camps, offering quiet prayers. Guards were firm but not cruel. And for many Germans, this behavior was confusing. They had been told that Americans were monsters, that capture meant torture or death. But what they found was very different. An officer named Friedrich Bauer later recalled, "I was ready to die. Instead, an American handed me a cigarette. He said, 'You're safe now.' That sentence stayed with me forever." Small gestures like that began to change everything. The prisoners started to see their captors not as enemies, but as people. The guards, too, realized that these men were not the fanatics from Nazi propaganda, but mostly farmers, mechanics, and sons who had been forced into war. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. military had set up a massive network of Reinweisenlager camps across Western Germany. At one point, they held nearly 2 million POWs. Conditions were harsh in the beginning, overcrowded, muddy, short on food, but they slowly improved. Each day, soldiers were counted, fed, and reorganized. Some were sent to France for labor, others to Britain or directly to the United States. The first ships carrying German POWs to America departed from the French port of Le Havre in July 1945. The men stood silently on deck, watching Europe disappear behind them. None knew what awaited them across the ocean. Rumors spread. Some said they'd be forced to build American cities, others that they would never return home. But the reality was far more unexpected. In America, they would become workers, students, and, for the first time, witnesses to a free society. Before that, though, their identity as enemies had to fade. The Americans began a slow process called reorientation, teaching prisoners about democracy, fairness, and truth. Camp libraries were opened. Lectures were held. Newspapers were printed inside the fences, written by the prisoners themselves. At night, they listened to the radio. They heard jazz, American news, and voices that spoke not of hate, but of rebuilding. For some, it was the first time they realized how deeply they had been lied to by Nazi propaganda. A young soldier named Karl Neumann later said, "We learned that the enemy we had fought for years was not what we were told. They had families, laughter, freedom. We began to question everything we once believed." That questioning became the first step toward change. Inside the camps, a new sense of identity formed, not as Hitler's soldiers, but as men seeking a second chance. Some began writing diaries, others drew pictures of the farms, the trees, the wide open skies of the West. For many, it was their first peaceful time in years. And yet, the guilt remained. News from home told of devastation. Wives missing, parents starving, children begging for food. Every letter carried the smell of ashes. The prisoners felt torn between relief and despair. They were alive, but their homeland was dying. Still, one truth grew stronger with each passing day. The Americans were not their enemies anymore. As 1945 turned into 1946, the men in gray uniforms were no longer seen as threats. Many had become trusted workers and even friends to the people they labored for. Guards shared cigarettes, farmers shared stories. The fences remained, but in their hearts, the war had ended. One guard later remembered, "They stopped calling us Americans. They started calling us friends." From enemies to prisoners, and slowly, from prisoners to men once again. This was the quiet transformation that few history books ever mention. While Europe lay in ruins, behind the fences of America, something remarkable was happening. Understanding, forgiveness, and the first fragile seeds of peace. When the first German prisoners arrived in America, they were stunned. The voyage across the Atlantic had been long and silent. Weeks spent below deck, guarded but unharmed. Most expected punishment or hard labor. But when they stepped off the ships, they saw something that felt almost unreal. Clean camps, green fields, and civilians smiling at them. This was not the revenge they had feared. This was something else entirely. The United States had built more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps across the country, from Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to California. Each camp was surrounded by tall fences of barbed wire and guarded watchtowers. But inside, life followed rules, order, and even a strange sense of normalcy. At dawn, a whistle blew. The prisoners lined up for roll call. Their numbers shouted aloud. Breakfast followed: oatmeal, bread, sometimes eggs. Then came work assignments. Many were sent to nearby farms, lumber mills, or factories, helping replace the American workers who had gone off to fight. Others stayed behind to cook, repair buildings, or tend gardens. The Geneva Convention allowed POWs to work, as long as it wasn't in war industries. For every day of labor, they earned a small wage, just a few cents, but enough to buy soap, stationery, or even cigarettes at the camp canteen. It was strange, almost peaceful. The men who had once marched under the swastika now picked cotton, built barns, and milked cows for American farmers. One of them, Werner Koch, later said, "I had fought in France, in Russia, in Italy. I had seen hell. And now, I was repairing fences for a man who called me neighbor. It felt like waking from a nightmare." In the evenings, when the sun dropped behind the wire, the camp changed again. Prisoners gathered in groups. Some played chess, others sang German songs softly under the stars. Many learned English from small books given by the Red Cross. They called their guards by name, and the guards did the same. At first, Americans from nearby towns were suspicious. They had lost brothers, husbands, and sons in the war. Seeing German uniforms walking through their fields was a painful reminder. But over time, something unexpected happened: trust. Farmers discovered that the German POWs were hardworking and disciplined. Many locals even preferred them to hired labor. They were polite, efficient, and grateful. In some small towns, Sunday church services quietly welcomed them, sitting in the back rows, heads bowed. For the prisoners, this simple kindness felt almost holy. They were still behind fences, still enemies on paper, but in spirit they were being treated as men again. Inside the camps, cultural life began to grow. There were libraries filled with German and English books. Classes were organized: history, math, even philosophy. Some prisoners painted murals on the Baroque walls. Others built small theaters where they staged plays about home and loss. Musicians formed orchestras using handmade instruments. The U.S. officers encouraged this. They saw it as a way to re-educate, to show the values of democracy and free thought. Newspapers written by prisoners circulated through the camps, discussing world news, literature, and sometimes quietly questioning the Nazi past. A few officers also noticed a deeper change taking place. The longer the men stayed in America, the more they seemed to reflect on their actions. Some spoke openly of guilt, about the war, the lies, and the crimes they had seen. Others simply stayed silent, but their eyes told enough. Still, life behind the wire was not without hardship. Loneliness was heavy. Letters from Germany were slow to arrive, sometimes censored, often carrying bad news. Families were missing, homes destroyed, entire towns gone. Many prisoners cried quietly after mail call, hiding their faces in their hands. Winters were cold, especially in the northern states. The barracks were wooden and drafty. Snow blew through the cracks. But even then, they were better off than millions back in Europe. Some camps developed deep bonds between guards and prisoners. In one Texas camp, an American sergeant named Robert Daniels became close friends with several German POWs. After the war, they exchanged letters for decades. In another camp in Minnesota, prisoners built a small chapel from wood scraps. The guards helped them raise the roof. On Christmas Eve, they sang Silent Night in both English and German. The sound drifted over the frozen fences, reminding everyone that peace was possible. Over time, the barbed wire seemed less like a prison and more like a fragile border between two worlds, the world of war and the world of humanity. But not every camp was the same. In a few places, conditions were rougher. Discipline was strict, punishments severe for escape attempts. A handful of prisoners died from illness or accidents. Yet, compared to the suffering in Europe's other camps, Soviet gulags, concentration camps, the American experience felt like mercy. By late 1946, the U.S. government began repatriating prisoners back to Europe. Many didn't want to go. The war was over, but Germany was in ruins. Factories destroyed, food scarce, cities in rubble. They knew they were returning to hunger and shame. Some wrote petitions begging to stay in America. One letter from a group of prisoners in Arkansas read, "We came here as enemies. We found honesty and respect. We wish to remain in the land that showed us both." But the orders were final. One by one, the camps emptied. The men packed their few belongings, letters, drawings, small handmade souvenirs, and boarded trains to the ports. As they left, many Americans lined the roads, waving goodbye. Some cried. For both sides, something human had been restored. Behind the fences, hatred had melted into understanding. Strangers had become friends. And as the ships carried the last of them home across the ocean, the men looked back at the fading American shore. Behind them lay barbed wire, but also dignity, peace, and perhaps the first glimpse of a better future. One of them whispered to another, "If this was captivity, then freedom must be beautiful." For the German prisoners who lived behind American barbed wire, life was a paradox. They were enemies, yet they were treated with humanity. They were captives, yet they found freedom of thought. They had fought against America, yet America became a place of safety, learning, and, unexpectedly, dignity. The paradox was evident from the very first day. Soldiers who had once faced the horrors of the Eastern Front now walked through green fields in Georgia or the rolling plains of Oklahoma. The fences reminded them they were prisoners. The clean barracks, hot meals, and orderly routines reminded them they were human. It was a strange, almost surreal contrast to the destruction they had left behind in Europe. In these camps, the American system operated with surprising efficiency. Roll calls were precise, meals were served on schedule, medical care was available. Yet beyond the routines, a silent moral lesson unfolded. Guards and prisoners worked side by side. Farmhands and mechanics became temporary neighbors. Small acts, a shared cigarette, a word of encouragement, a smile, blurred the line between captor and captive. Many prisoners noted the difference immediately. One German soldier, Johann Richter, wrote in his diary, "I had crossed the ocean expecting punishment. Instead, I was given work, meals, and something I had not felt in years: respect. I could not reconcile it with all the hatred I had been taught to expect." This respect was not extended to all German prisoners equally. Officers often received better accommodations and more freedom. Ordinary soldiers sometimes faced strict rules or harsh winters. Yet even in the worst conditions, the Americans followed the Geneva Convention, offering shelter, food, and medical care. In many ways, it was a stark contrast to what the men had endured under Nazi command or feared in Soviet camps. Education became a powerful tool in this paradox. Libraries, newspapers, and lectures introduced the prisoners to democracy, history, and philosophy. Some learned English. Others studied maps of a world they had never known. For men who had spent years in indoctrination, this sudden access to knowledge and free thought was bewildering and transformative. Many began to reflect on their own actions. The propaganda that once painted Americans as cruel, decadent, or weak now seemed false. They had fought a people who offered them safety and learning. They had feared vengeance and instead found humanity. It was a lesson that cut deep, stirring guilt, gratitude, and wonder all at once. One officer, Ernst Vogel, described it vividly. "I was taught to despise America, to hate every American. But here I worked in a garden, my hands in the soil, an American beside me. I realized the enemy I had feared was not the man but the war itself." The paradox extended beyond personal reflection. While the prisoners lived under strict control, they were also allowed creativity. They built theaters, staged plays, formed orchestras, and even held religious services. The American administration encouraged this, believing that cultural engagement would aid re-education and reduce unrest. For men who had known only war, this was almost unbelievable. The outside world added to the complexity. News from Europe told of devastation, bombed cities, hunger, and displaced families. Many POWs feared what awaited them upon return. They had survived war and captivity, only to face a homeland that no longer existed. Some grew anxious, some depressed. Yet, even in these fears, the paradox of America was present. Far from their ruined homes, they had safety, structure, and care. Friendships between Americans and Germans grew quietly, too. Farmers who supervised POW labor sometimes invited men into their homes. Guards shared meals, offered advice, or simply listened. These small bonds often lasted decades. Men who arrived as enemies left as witnesses to the human capacity for kindness, even across battle lines. Yet not all felt gratitude. Some resented their captivity. They saw the fences, the orders, and the regulations as chains. They longed for home, for freedom, for the familiar, even in ruins. The paradox cut both ways. America was a land of safety and dignity, but also a reminder of loss, exile, and displacement. In letters and memoirs, many reflected on this strange duality. They wrote of being guarded yet trusted, confined yet treated like men, hated yet respected. They described learning, working, and playing, while waiting for a world that had changed beyond recognition. Ultimately, the American paradox shaped the post-war generation of German POWs. It taught them that the enemy could be humane, that captivity could bring reflection, and that even in war, the foundations of decency and compassion could survive. The lessons were not simple, nor were they easily forgotten. As the prisoners finally prepared for repatriation in 1946 and 1947, they carried more than suitcases or letters. They carried memories of a land that had defied expectation, a land that held barbed wire and freedom in the same space, cruelty and compassion in the same hands. A land where enemies could become prisoners, and prisoners could learn the meaning of humanity. Life behind the fences of American POW camps was not just survival, it was work. From the moment they arrived, German prisoners were assigned tasks that ranged from farming to construction, from kitchen duty to factory work. The work was necessary for the camps to function, but it was also a deliberate part of reorientation. Through labor, prisoners learned discipline, routine, and slowly responsibility. At first, the labor was unfamiliar. Soldiers who had marched across Europe in uniform now wielded shovels, hammers, and plows. Some were skilled tradesmen, others had never held tools in their lives. Yet day after day, they worked alongside Americans, building barns, repairing roads, and harvesting crops. Their efforts helped sustain local communities where labor shortages were acute after so many men had gone to fight. The work brought structure to their days. Roll calls, assigned shifts, and set schedules replaced the chaos of surrender. Prisoners learned that effort had consequence. A job well done brought small privileges, extra food, or recognition from camp officers. It was a world far removed from the battlefield, yet it carried its own lessons. For every hour of work, POWs received small wages. The pay was modest, a few cents per day, but it allowed prisoners to purchase simple comforts: soap, stationery, tobacco, or sweets from the camp canteen. For men who had known hunger and deprivation, this was extraordinary. Money became a tool of autonomy, however small, and an important bridge between captivity and dignity. In the fields of Texas or the orchards of Georgia, the prisoners learned more than farming. They learned trust. Farmers observed their diligence and honesty. In many cases, Americans preferred POW labor over hired hands. Some prisoners were invited into homes, offered coffee, or even shared meals with local families. It was a lesson in humanity that contrasted sharply with everything they had been taught about the enemy. One soldier, Heinrich Bauer, remembered, "I had fought against Americans, believing them cruel and greedy. Yet here I worked in a barn," the farmer smiled, "and I realized that freedom is not just about leaving the wire. It is in being treated as a man." Beyond labor, prisoners experienced a kind of freedom within the camps. They could form clubs, organize sports, study, or engage in cultural activities. Some camps had orchestras, theaters, and libraries. Education was encouraged, not enforced. The more prisoners embraced these opportunities, the more they felt a sense of agency, a paradoxical freedom within confinement. Work also provided a sense of purpose. After years of fighting a losing war, being useful once again, even in a small way, was vital for mental health. Prisoners built fences, harvested crops, and repaired machinery not because they were forced to hate or kill, but because someone trusted them to do a job well. For many, this was a revelation. Productivity without violence, cooperation without coercion. Wages, work, and freedom created bonds. Prisoners often worked in groups, forming friendships across the ranks. They exchanged stories from home, shared news from Germany, and sometimes laughed together for the first time in years. Guards noticed these bonds, and some joined in small ways. A shared joke, an extra ration of food, or a kind word. Yet the paradox remained. They were still prisoners. The fences were still there. Orders still had to be obeyed. Freedom was partial and conditional. But within these limits, the men learned self-respect, discipline, and a vision of a world beyond war. By 1946, the American POW experience had proven remarkable. German soldiers who had arrived as enemies now left as skilled laborers, thoughtful individuals, and men who had glimpsed a different kind of society. Work and wages were more than economic. They were instruments of transformation, teaching lessons that would last long after the war and captivity ended. And when the day finally came to return home, the men carried not just clothes and letters, but knowledge of something rare. A place where captivity could teach freedom. A place where work could restore dignity. A place where the paradox of war could, unexpectedly, reveal the possibility of humanity. Amid the fences, barbed wire, and strict routines of American POW camps, something unexpected began to flourish: human connections. For men who had known only war, fear, and mistrust for years, these relationships became lifelines. Proof that even in captivity, people could reach out, understand, and care for one another. The most immediate connections were among the prisoners themselves. In the barracks, men shared stories of home, childhood memories, and lost families. They taught each other trades, skills, and languages. Young soldiers learned from veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front. Older men were reminded of hope by the laughter of the young. Friendships were born out of shared hardship, yet they carried warmth, humor, and loyalty. Work assignments also forged bonds. Side by side in the fields, barns, or factories, prisoners relied on one another for efficiency, safety, and companionship. Tasks that were monotonous or exhausting became opportunities for teamwork. They discovered that cooperation could exist without hierarchy or fear, a radical shift from the chain-of-command brutality they had endured in the Wehrmacht. Interactions with American civilians and guards created a more profound transformation. Farmers who supervised POW labor often treated them with respect, sometimes offering meals, advice, or small gestures of friendship. Guards who had expected hostility often found themselves sharing stories, cigarettes, or laughter. These moments were small, but they left lasting impressions, showing prisoners that not all humans were defined by war or ideology. One former POW, Karl Meyer, recalled, I never imagined that an American could smile at me, talk to me as an equal, or trust me with work on his land. It changed the way I thought about people, about enemies, and about myself. Religious and cultural gatherings strengthened these human connections. Prisoners formed choirs, staged plays, held debates, and celebrated holidays together. In some camps, small chapels were built from scrap materials, and both prisoners and guards attended services. Music, storytelling, and games became bridges across barriers, fostering mutual respect and understanding. Even small acts mattered. A shared cigarette during a break, a whispered joke at night, a cup of coffee offered by a farmer or a guard. These tiny moments became symbols of humanity, quiet but powerful reminders that war could not destroy the human capacity to connect. Letters also played a key role. Prisoners wrote to their families in Germany, sharing news, hopes, and regrets. They wrote to friends they had met in the camp, keeping memories alive across continents. Some formed bonds with American families, exchanging letters long after the war ended. These connections often lasted decades, testifying to the enduring impact of kindness and understanding. Yet these relationships carried complexity. The prisoners were still enemies on paper, still bound by rules and fences. Some Americans struggled with lingering anger over the war. Some prisoners felt guilt for having fought under the Nazi regime. But even within these tensions, connection grew. Friendship and understanding emerged as forces stronger than fear or prejudice. By the time repatriation began in 1946 and 1947, the prisoners carried more than memories of work or confinement. They carried stories of human connection, bonds with fellow prisoners, guards, farmers, and even strangers. They had learned that friendship could transcend nationality, ideology, and past enmity. One American officer later remarked, "We came to guard them, but in the end we learned from them." In the quiet moments behind the wire, humanity showed itself in ways the war had never allowed. These connections were more than survival tools. They were lessons. They taught forgiveness, empathy, and the power of shared humanity. For men who had witnessed destruction, hatred, and loss, human connection became a fragile but enduring bridge to a better world. And as the fences emptied and prisoners boarded ships home, they took these lessons with them, carrying memories of kindness, trust, and friendship that would shape the rest of their lives. For many German prisoners of war in the United States, captivity became more than survival. It became an unexpected opportunity for education and self-reflection. The American military understood that simply guarding millions of defeated soldiers was not enough. They implemented programs designed to expose POWs to new ideas, new ways of life, and a society very different from the one that had led them into war. At the heart of this effort was re-education. The goal was not punishment, nor indoctrination in the conventional sense. Instead, it was a deliberate attempt to introduce prisoners to democratic principles, the rule of law, and civil society. Classes were offered in English language skills, mathematics, history, civics, and even literature. Some camps organized lectures on economics and politics. Libraries grew in importance, providing access to newspapers, magazines, and books in both German and English. The impact on prisoners was profound. Soldiers who had been trained for war and propaganda found themselves discussing ideas they had never encountered before. Concepts such as individual rights, civic responsibility, and personal freedom were alien yet fascinating. Many wrote in their diaries about moments of surprise and wonder, realizing that the world they had been taught to fight against was more complex, more humane, and more thoughtful than they had imagined. One former POW, Heinz Weber, described the experience vividly. "We were supposed to be enemies, but instead we were given books, lessons, and a chance to think. I began to question everything I had been taught about America, about democracy, and even about ourselves. Work assignments also contributed to this process. As prisoners labored on farms, in factories, or in repair projects, they observed American society firsthand. They saw a culture of efficiency and fairness, where employers expected respect and offered guidance. They witnessed communities functioning without fear or violence, families enjoying their homes, and citizens participating in everyday decisions. For many, this was a revelation, a glimpse of a world where personal initiative and cooperation were valued above coercion and obedience. Cultural and recreational programs reinforced the lessons of re-education. Prisoners formed musical groups, staged theatrical performances, and created newspapers reporting on camp life. These activities encouraged creativity, critical thinking, and teamwork. Sports tournaments and organized games allowed soldiers to compete fairly, celebrating skill and effort rather than brute force. All of these experiences subtly instilled a sense of personal responsibility and respect for others. American officers observed these changes carefully. They noticed that men who engaged in educational or cultural programs were less likely to cause disturbances or attempt escape. More importantly, they witnessed personal transformation. Men who had arrived bitter, suspicious, and loyal to the Nazi cause were beginning to think independently, question propaganda, and reflect on the consequences of their past actions. The broader lessons extended beyond the camps themselves. Many prisoners began to dream about life after the war in ways they had never imagined. They saw a country where opportunity existed for those willing to work, learn, and contribute. They observed a society where effort could lead to advancement, where people were judged less for their past and more for their actions in the present. This exposure planted seeds of hope, and in some cases, a vision of a future they might one day participate in, whether in Germany or, for some, in America itself. At the same time, prisoners faced the reality of their shattered homeland. Letters from families described destroyed cities, food shortages, and the collapse of infrastructure. While the American camps offered safety and opportunity, they were also reminders of the responsibilities and challenges awaiting them at home. Many soldiers wrestled with guilt, shame, and anxiety, even as they absorbed the lessons of freedom and democracy. The paradox of captivity and education became central to the POW experience. Confined within fences and under guard, they discovered freedom of thought and exposure to a culture that valued individuality. The discipline and structure of camp life provided security, while intellectual and cultural programs offered personal growth. Prisoners often realized that the lessons learned in captivity could not have been obtained on the battlefield or in Germany itself. One American officer reflected on this transformation. "We did not just hold men, we tried to teach them. And in teaching, we saw the power of ideas." The same soldiers who came as enemies often left as thinkers, questioning the world and their place in it. By the time repatriation began in 1946 and 1947, many prisoners carried more than memories of work, fences, or meals. They carried knowledge, skills, and insights that shaped their future. Some returned to Germany determined to rebuild not only their own lives but also their communities, influenced by the principles of fairness, education, and opportunity they had observed in America. Others chose to emigrate, seeking a new life in a country that had once been the enemy but had become a model of hope. In essence, the American POW experience was paradoxical and transformative. Captivity became a classroom. Work became a lesson. Freedom became tangible even behind barbed wire. For many, the experience revealed the American dream, not as propaganda or myth, but as a living example of how opportunity, education, and respect could shape the lives of even the most unlikely students. And as the prisoners prepared to leave, they understood something remarkable. that the war had ended not only with defeat and surrender, but with a chance for renewal, insight, and the possibility of a better world. The day finally came when German prisoners of war were allowed to return home. For many, it was a moment they had longed for throughout months or even years of captivity. Yet the anticipation was tempered by anxiety, uncertainty, and a growing awareness that the world they had left behind no longer existed. Across the Atlantic, ships carried thousands of men back to a homeland they barely recognized. Europe's cities were shadows of themselves. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, and countless smaller towns lay in ruins. Factories were destroyed, bridges collapsed, and entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Returning soldiers confronted a landscape of devastation, where familiar streets and landmarks had vanished under bombs and fire. For many POWs, the first shock was immediate. They stepped off trains into towns where broken buildings, smoldering debris, and displaced families painted a grim picture. Hunger was widespread, and shortages of food, fuel, and clean water were severe. Families were scattered. Some had survived the bombings, others had perished. Many soldiers learned upon arrival that loved ones were missing or dead. The psychological impact was immense. Men who had survived the dangers of battle and the rigors of captivity now faced a homeland that seemed almost uninhabitable. Some felt relief at being home. Others were engulfed in despair. The contrast between the safety and stability they had known in American camps and the chaos in Germany was jarring. One former POW, Fritz Lang, wrote in his diary, "I had imagined returning home as a joy, a reward for survival. Instead, I found ruins, hunger, and silence. The city I knew was gone. My family, I could not find them immediately. The war had taken everything, and we were left with nothing." The challenges of rebuilding life were immediate. Housing was scarce. Many found shelter in partially destroyed buildings or shared cramped apartments with strangers. Food was rationed, and the black market thrived as people sought to survive. Work was hard to come by, and those who had skills in factories or farms faced competition from countless others who had also survived. Yet the experiences of American captivity had left a lasting mark. Many returning POWs had learned new trades, gained literacy in English, and understood discipline and responsibility in ways that could be applied to rebuilding Germany. The sense of organization, routine, and productivity cultivated in the camps became tools for survival at home. Some men used their camp experience to assist in reconstruction, working in agriculture, infrastructure, or local industry. Family reunions were often bittersweet. Some parents, spouses, and children had survived, but they bore the scars of starvation, displacement, and loss. Others were gone forever. For soldiers, these reunions were emotionally complex, a mix of relief, grief, and the dawning responsibility of helping their families recover. Beyond the immediate hardships, returning POWs faced a moral and political reckoning. They had been trained and commanded under the Nazi regime, yet they had witnessed a different model of society in America, one based on freedom, education, and opportunity. Many began to question the values and propaganda that had guided them during the war. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Germany had been destroyed by ideology, yet they had learned that society could be rebuilt on principles of fairness and human dignity. Communities themselves faced collective trauma. Civilians struggled with loss, famine, and the collapse of civil infrastructure. Yet, in pockets across the country, small initiatives of rebuilding emerged. Returning POWs often participated in these efforts, repairing roads, clearing rubble, and helping neighbors. Their labor was both practical and symbolic, a bridge between the past they had fought in and a future they could help create. The psychological adjustment was gradual. Many former POWs struggled with memories of combat, captivity, and the paradoxical kindness of their American experience. Letters, diaries, and conversations reveal that some felt alienated from the Germany they returned to, longing instead for the structured, humane environment they had known in American camps. Others channeled these experiences into community rebuilding, education, or advocacy for social reform. Despite the destruction and suffering, hope began to emerge. Germany's post-war recovery would be slow and painful, but the lessons carried by returning POWs were invaluable. Discipline, work ethic, respect for others, and the knowledge that societies could function on principles of fairness and opportunity became seeds for renewal. Men who had been prisoners, once enemies, now returned as contributors to reconstruction, a paradox of human resilience. One observer later noted, they had survived war, captivity, and loss, and when they returned, they brought with them the discipline, insight, and humanity to help rebuild a shattered nation. Their journey had taught them not only survival, but the meaning of responsibility and community. By 1947, German POWs were fully repatriated. They walked through the ruins of their country with heavy hearts but new perspectives. They had witnessed both the horrors of war and the possibilities of humane society. The contrast shaped their vision for the future. A Germany that could rise from rubble, learn from its past, and embrace values that promoted stability, dignity, and hope. In the end, the return to Germany was not merely a physical journey. It was the culmination of a profound transformation. From soldiers to prisoners, from enemies to students of humanity, and finally, from survivors to citizens capable of rebuilding their homeland. The war was over, but the lessons of captivity, education, and the paradoxical kindness of America would stay with them forever. By the time German prisoners of war had lived months, and in some cases years, in the United States, a strange transformation had taken place. Men who had once been taught to hate America now found themselves appreciating its order, its fairness, and the basic decency extended to them behind barbed wire. For many, captivity had become not only tolerable but surprisingly instructive. An experience that taught skills, responsibility, and a vision of a life vastly different from the one waiting in war-torn Germany. As 1946 turned into 1947, the process of repatriation began. German POWs were ordered to return home, and for most, the announcement stirred excitement tinged with fear. Their families were waiting, or so they hoped. But Germany had changed. Cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce. Jobs were uncertain. Those who had been through the structured, humane environment of American camps now faced chaos, deprivation, and the lingering scars of a defeated nation. It was in this context that the first formal pleas to stay began. Groups of prisoners wrote letters, petitions, and appeals to the American military authorities, expressing their desire to remain in the United States. Their arguments were striking in their sincerity. They were no longer speaking as soldiers or enemies of a nation, but as individuals seeking stability, safety, and opportunity. Many highlighted the practical reasons for staying. They had learned trades, farming skills, and industrial labor techniques during captivity. They could contribute to American communities as workers in agriculture, factories, and reconstruction projects. Letters described their value as responsible, disciplined, and motivated laborers, qualities that had been repeatedly noted by American farmers, officers, and guards. Others spoke of the moral and emotional impact of their time in the United States. They wrote of how Americans treated them with respect, fairness, and even friendship. They described teachers, guards, and neighbors who had shown them kindness, provided guidance, and offered opportunities for personal growth. These letters often conveyed a deep sense of gratitude, alongside the wish to continue a life built on principles of order, decency, and community. One petition from a group of POWs in Arkansas read, "We came here as enemies, expecting punishment or harsh treatment. Instead, we found guidance, education, and kindness. We have learned a new way of life, and we ask for permission to remain, to work honestly, and to contribute to this society that has welcomed us." The pleas were sometimes personal, sometimes collective. Soldiers wrote individually, recounting their experiences of education, work, and cultural life in the camps. Others drafted petitions signed by dozens or even hundreds of men, emphasizing their integration into local communities and the bonds they had formed. They described how they had assisted in farm work, repaired roads, tended livestock, and participated in camp schools and newspapers. Their letters often reflected both humility and hope, acknowledging the debt owed to the Americans while asking for the extraordinary grace of permission to stay. The American response was complex. Military authorities were sympathetic in some cases but bound by policy and the obligations of post-war repatriation. Civilians who had known loss and destruction were at times wary. Yet the appeals themselves demonstrated a remarkable phenomenon. Men who had been trained as soldiers of an enemy nation were now seeking a peaceful life through honest work and integration into the society they once fought against. This shift was unprecedented in modern history. In camps across the southern, midwestern, and eastern United States, POWs who had arrived as disciplined, fearful, and ideologically indoctrinated soldiers now expressed desires for civilian life, personal growth, and the pursuit of stability. Their letters often mentioned learning English, gaining literacy, participating in cultural programs, and understanding the principles of democracy and civil responsibility. One former POW, Ludwig Steiner, later recalled, "I had expected only orders, fences, and fear. Instead, I found opportunity and trust. When I was told I would return to Germany, I felt fear, not joy. I had built a life here, small, disciplined, and safe. I did not want to leave it behind." The emotional undertone of these appeals was clear. The men were torn between two worlds. Germany was home by birth, culture, and family, but it was a country destroyed, hungry, and uncertain. America was foreign, yet it had offered safety, structure, and a glimpse of possibility. The paradox haunted many. The land they had been taught to hate had become a source of security, education, and respect. Some Americans were moved by these pleas. Farmers who had supervised POW labor testified on behalf of their workers, emphasizing reliability, honesty, and contribution to the community. Officers who had overseen educational programs highlighted prisoners' intellectual curiosity, moral reflection, and the genuine transformations they had witnessed. These testimonials reinforced the notion that captivity had been not only humane but also transformative. Despite the heartfelt petitions, the majority of POWs were ultimately repatriated. American policy prioritized returning soldiers to their homeland to restore post-war order. Yet the very act of petitioning, and the testimonies that accompanied it, left a lasting impression on both prisoners and the Americans who interacted with them. It was evidence of profound human adaptation, moral growth, and the capacity to seek hope even after profound trauma. The plea to stay was, in essence, a human story, a testimony to resilience, reflection, and aspiration. It revealed the paradox of captivity. Men taken as enemies could, under the right conditions, learn to value labor, education, and decency, to seek a new life, and to appeal not for vengeance, but for opportunity. In some cases, a small number of prisoners were granted permission to immigrate to the United States after their release. Many others carried the lessons and aspirations of their petitions back to Germany, using their experience to rebuild lives, families, and communities. The letters, diaries, and memories of these appeals remain a testament to the extraordinary journey from war, captivity, an enmity to hope, reflection, and the human desire for a second chance. Ultimately, the plea to stay was more than a request. It was a symbol of transformation, reconciliation, and the enduring power of human connection. It reminded the world that even in the aftermath of war, men could choose hope, education, and dignity over hatred, fear, and destruction. And for those who wrote, signed, and supported these pleas, it became a defining chapter in the story of survival, adaptation, and the search for a better life. The story of German prisoners of war in the United States did not end when the fences were dismantled and the ships sailed home. The lessons, experiences, and human interactions that unfolded behind American barbed wire left a profound and lasting imprint on those who lived through them. This chapter explores what historians, memoirs, and first-hand accounts call the American effect, the deep and enduring influence of American captivity on the lives of former POWs. For many soldiers, the first and most obvious impact was practical. During their months or years in American camps, prisoners gained exposure to new skills, trades, and ways of organizing work. Farm labor, factory assignments, construction projects, and educational programs taught them discipline, efficiency, and responsibility. Men who had arrived unskilled in manual labor or civilian trades left with experience that proved invaluable once they returned to a devastated Germany. The camps had, inadvertently, become vocational schools, instilling work habits that would help rebuild homes, cities, and communities. But the effect went far beyond practical skills. Perhaps the most profound transformation was moral and psychological. Prisoners who had been indoctrinated to hate Americans began to see them as individuals, complex, fair, and even compassionate. Guards and civilians who treated POWs with decency created a model of behavior that contrasted sharply with the violence, coercion, and fear that had dominated Europe during the war. Soldiers began to reflect on their own actions, their allegiance to Nazi ideology, and the destructive consequences of blind obedience. One former prisoner, Eric Muller, wrote, "I came as a soldier trained to obey and to despise. I left as a man who had witnessed kindness from those I had been taught to fear. America changed the way I thought about authority, morality, and my own responsibility." Education played a key role in shaping this effect. Camp libraries, lectures, and newspapers introduced POWs to ideas about democracy, civil society, and personal freedom. Classes in English, mathematics, history, and philosophy encouraged critical thinking. Prisoners discussed ideas openly, often for the first time in their lives. These experiences fostered self-reflection, challenging propaganda and offering perspectives that could not have been accessed in Nazi Germany. Cultural and social activities also left a lasting imprint. Prisoners formed orchestras, theaters, and reading clubs. Sports tournaments encouraged fair competition and teamwork. Even small acts, a conversation with a farmer, a shared cigarette, or a smile from a guard, reinforced the sense that human decency could exist beyond ideology or nationality. These interactions planted seeds of empathy and understanding that would endure long after repatriation. The American effect was not uniform. Individual experiences varied widely depending on camp conditions, the attitudes of officers and guards, and the prisoner's own openness to new ideas. Some men resisted change, clinging to old beliefs and grievances. Others embraced the opportunities for learning, reflection, and personal growth. But across the camps, the overall trend was unmistakable. American captivity had a civilizing, educational, and morally corrective influence on many POWs. Upon returning to Germany, the effect became visible in multiple ways. Ex-prisoners often applied the skills and work habits they had acquired in rebuilding homes, farms, and businesses. They became advocates for education, civility, and responsible leadership. Those who had learned English, literacy, or practical trades sometimes emigrated, contributing to communities abroad. Many carried personal stories of American kindness, fairness, and opportunity, sharing lessons learned with families, neighbors, and colleagues. The moral dimension of the American effect was equally important. Men who had witnessed humane treatment often rejected extremist ideology, embraced reconciliation, and advocated tolerance. Some used their experiences to mentor younger generations, warning them of the dangers of fanaticism and promoting democratic values. In a nation struggling to recover from totalitarian rule, these lessons had a tangible impact on the social and cultural reconstruction of post-war Germany. Historians note that the American effect was subtle yet durable. It was not the result of coercion or propaganda, but of observation, reflection, and humane treatment. Soldiers who arrived as instruments of war were transformed by a society that valued labor, learning, and moral integrity. By modeling trust, fairness, and opportunity, Americans left an enduring imprint on minds and lives, a living testament to the power of example. Even decades later, former POWs spoke of the effect with reverence. Letters, memoirs, and interviews reveal recurring themes: gratitude for education and opportunity, astonishment at human decency, and a commitment to rebuild lives guided by the principles they had observed in the United States. For many, the experience was transformative, influencing choices about family, career, civic engagement, and worldview. In essence, the American effect was more than survival or labor. It was a humanizing force, teaching responsibility, critical thinking, empathy, and the potential for personal growth even in circumstances of confinement. It demonstrated that the experience of captivity could be paradoxically liberating, not through physical freedom, but through the education of the mind and the example of moral conduct. The fences that had confined them were temporary. The lessons they carried were permanent. As former POWs returned to Europe, shared stories, and rebuilt communities, they became living proof of an extraordinary truth. Even in the aftermath of war, human kindness, education, and opportunity could leave a legacy that transcended borders, ideologies, and enmity. Ultimately, the American effect was a reminder that history is shaped not only by battles and treaties, but by the quiet, transformative power of humane treatment, reflection, and the enduring influence of example. For the men who lived it, it was a lesson in morality, labor, and life. A chapter of the war they would carry forever, long after the fences had disappeared. As the years passed, the experiences of German prisoners of war in the United States became less visible in history. Public attention shifted to rebuilding nations, commemorating battles, and remembering the dead. Yet behind these grand narratives existed a quieter story, one of personal transformation, human connection, and resilience, often overlooked, yet profoundly important. These were the forgotten stories of men who lived through captivity, education, and the paradoxical kindness of a former enemy. Many of these stories began in the barracks at dawn, with roll calls and assigned work. Soldiers who had fought in Europe now found themselves tending fields, repairing barns, or learning trades they had never imagined. In this seemingly mundane labor, deep human experiences unfolded. Men discovered camaraderie, learned responsibility, and confronted the contrast between the cruelty they had known in war and the decency extended by their captors. These everyday moments, a shared joke, a cooperative task, a patient guard, were often lost in historical accounts but remained vivid in memory. Education was another source of forgotten stories. Classrooms in the camps taught English, mathematics, history, and civics. Prisoners read newspapers, attended lectures, and engaged in debates. Many had never encountered ideas about democracy or civil rights, and the exposure was transformative. Some men embraced this learning with enthusiasm, while others resisted, skeptical or suspicious. Yet even resistance often gave way to curiosity, reflection, and moral questioning. One prisoner, Friedrich Koenig, described in his diary, "I came here as a soldier, trained to follow orders and believe only in strength. But here, in a small classroom in Arkansas, I first learned to think for myself. The words of books and the patience of teachers changed me more than any battlefield ever could." Cultural and recreational activities created additional layers of human experience. Theaters, orchestras, newspapers, and sports tournaments allowed prisoners to explore creativity, teamwork, and leadership. These moments offered escape from confinement, yes, but they also nurtured self-expression and the realization that life could be meaningful even under strict supervision. A prisoner performing in a camp play or participating in a football match experienced victory and pride in ways unrelated to war, yet deeply personal and transformative. Connections with Americans were central to these forgotten stories. Farmers who oversaw laborers often formed bonds of trust and even friendship. Guards who had expected hostility discovered humanity in cooperation, laughter, and shared effort. Simple acts, a cup of coffee, a cigarette, a smile, became symbols of moral clarity and mutual respect. These interactions left impressions that lasted a lifetime, influencing perspectives on culture, morality, and human potential. Yet these stories were fragile, often left unrecorded. Returning to Germany, many men faced destruction, hunger, and displacement. The urgent task of rebuilding lives left little room for reflection or storytelling. Memories of kindness and learning in America were often overshadowed by loss, grief, and the struggle to survive in a devastated homeland. The POW experience, transformative though it had been, was quietly buried under the weight of historical necessity. Some stories, however, were preserved through letters and diaries. Men wrote to families, to friends, or even to themselves, documenting the paradoxical lessons of captivity, the coexistence of confinement and freedom, enemy and friend, labor and learning. These writings reveal a consistent theme, that transformation occurred not through coercion or punishment, but through education, respect, and opportunity. The forgotten stories also illuminate the moral evolution of many prisoners. Men who had been complicit in Nazi ideology began to question their actions, reflect on responsibility, and embrace principles of justice, fairness, and empathy. These personal reckonings were rarely publicized, yet they formed the foundation for post-war German society, influencing attitudes toward democracy, civic engagement, and reconciliation with former enemies. Historian testimonies underscore the significance of these narratives. While history books often focus on battles, political treaties, and mass movements, the human experiences in American POW camps provide insight into resilience, adaptability, and the subtle power of humane treatment. Soldiers returned not only with skills and discipline, but with perspectives on human decency and the possibility of peaceful coexistence. Lessons often hidden in the margins of historical memory. One former POW, Karl-Heinz Bauer, reflected decades later, "When I think of America, I do not recall flags or orders. I remember small kindnesses, long hours of work with friends, and the chance to learn something new. These were the moments that changed who I was, even if history forgot them." Ultimately, the forgotten stories serve as a reminder that history is shaped as much by everyday human experiences as by monumental events. They illustrate how captivity, labor, education, and small acts of kindness can leave enduring legacies in the minds and hearts of individuals. For the men who lived through these experiences, the lessons were lifelong. that enemies can become teachers, that confinement can nurture growth, and that human decency can thrive even in the shadow of war. Though often overlooked, these stories provide a vital perspective on the war's aftermath, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of reflection, learning, and connection. In remembering these forgotten stories, we honor the silent transformation of thousands of men who survived not only the battles of Europe, but also the battles within themselves. Their experiences testify to a remarkable truth, that even in captivity, humanity can flourish, lessons can be learned, and lives can be forever changed. As the last German prisoners of war left the United States and returned to a shattered homeland, a profound sense of reflection began to emerge. For men who had survived years of combat, captivity, and dislocation, the journey was more than physical. It was deeply personal, moral, and intellectual. These reflections, carried in diaries, letters, and memories, offer a window into the legacy of an extraordinary chapter of history, a chapter in which captivity unexpectedly became a catalyst for transformation. Many former POWs looked back on their time in America with a mix of gratitude and astonishment. They had entered the camps as enemies, trained to hate, obey, and fight. Yet they had been met with a society that valued labor, education, and decency. Guards and civilians alike treated them as human beings rather than mere prisoners, offering opportunities to work, learn, and grow. For men accustomed to the brutality and suspicion of war, this was a revelation, a demonstration that discipline and freedom could coexist, that authority could be exercised with fairness, and that humanity could persist even amid the aftermath of conflict. The practical lessons of captivity were undeniable. Prisoners had acquired trades, literacy, agricultural skills, and industrial expertise. Many had learned English and developed habits of punctuality, cooperation, and problem-solving. These skills would prove invaluable upon their return to Germany, a nation in ruins but in desperate need of rebuilding. The American experience had prepared them not only to survive, but to contribute meaningfully to the reconstruction of their families, communities, and country. Yet the legacy went beyond practicality. The moral and intellectual transformations were profound. Soldiers who had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology encountered a society rooted in fairness, civic responsibility, and respect for the individual. Exposure to democratic principles, freedom of thought, and ethical conduct encouraged self-reflection and reevaluation. Many men questioned their past actions, reconsidered their beliefs, and emerged with a deeper understanding of justice, morality, and human rights. One former POW, Hans Richter, wrote, "I had fought for orders, for loyalty to a regime, for ideology. In America, I learned to think for myself, to respect others, and to see that the world could be more than hatred and destruction." That lesson stayed with me long after I returned home. Social and cultural programs reinforced this transformation. Prisoners formed orchestras, staged plays, organized sports, and engaged in debates. These activities nurtured creativity, teamwork, and empathy. Small gestures, a shared meal, a kind word, or a smile from an American farmer or guard left lasting impressions, teaching the power of respect and kindness in daily life. Such experiences challenged deeply ingrained notions of enmity and hierarchy, revealing the capacity for reconciliation and understanding. The relationships forged within the camps became part of the legacy. Friendships among prisoners, connections with guards, and bonds with local civilians endured long after repatriation. Some former POWs emigrated to the United States, carrying with them lessons in labor, civility, and opportunity. Others returned to Germany with a renewed sense of responsibility, determined to apply what they had learned to the rebuilding of homes, schools, and communities. Across continents, the human networks formed in captivity continued to influence lives, bridging former divides and demonstrating the enduring impact of compassion and cooperation. Historians emphasize that the legacy of American captivity was subtle yet profound. Unlike propaganda or coercion, the transformation arose from lived experience, from observation, reflection, and participation in a structured, humane environment. Soldiers who arrived as adversaries often left with insights about morality, civic duty, and the potential for societal improvement. The lessons learned were not imposed. They were absorbed through engagement, labor, education, and daily human interaction. Psychologically, the experience offered a model for resilience. Men confronted with loss, uncertainty, and trauma discovered that they could adapt, learn, and find meaning even in restrictive circumstances. The POW camps became laboratories for personal growth, teaching patience, discipline, and empathy. For many, these skills and insights shaped the trajectory of their lives, influencing choices about family, career, civic involvement, and social responsibility. Culturally, the legacy endured through stories, memoirs, and letters. The forgotten stories of POWs, small acts of kindness, moments of learning, and the paradox of humane captivity provide historians and readers with a more nuanced understanding of the human capacity for change. They remind us that even in war, amid destruction and enmity, the potential for education, reflection, and moral growth persists. In the broader context, this chapter of history challenges assumptions about prisoners, enemies, and the outcomes of war. It demonstrates that transformation is possible not only through victory or defeat, but through humane treatment, opportunity, and engagement with ideas. The legacy of the American POW experience is thus both personal and societal, influencing individuals who rebuilt their lives and communities, and serving as a testament to the enduring value of empathy, fairness, and education. Decades later, former POWs reflected on their time with a mixture of nostalgia and insight. They remembered work, learning, and human connection, the paradoxical freedom within captivity, and the lessons of morality, discipline, and resilience. These reflections became part of their identity, shaping families, communities, and the historical memory of post-war reconstruction. Ultimately, the reflections and legacy of American captivity reveal a profound truth, that even in the shadow of war and imprisonment, the human spirit can be nurtured, minds can be educated, and hearts can be transformed. The fences and barbed wire could not contain growth, empathy, or moral reflection. The legacy of these experiences endures, a quiet but powerful testament to the possibility of change, the resilience of humanity, and the enduring impact of compassion, opportunity, and example.